Her name lives somewhere inside you, even if you have never spoken it aloud. You have seen her in old paintings, a pale figure stepping from open water, sun-colored hair loose around her shoulders, small winged creatures orbiting her like moths drawn to warmth. You have met her in old poems, in the verses people reach for when ordinary language fails them. Rome named her Venus. Greece called her Aphrodite. But tonight, you will come to know her not as the polished emblem that centuries of retelling have made her, not as the safe, decorative face of romantic love, but as something older and less comfortable. Something the builders of her ancient temples felt in their chests when they whispered her name into the dark. Her story does not belong only to history. It belongs to every person who has ever felt the tension between the life they were instructed to live and the one their blood kept reaching toward. It is the story of beauty as a form of power, of passion as a form of resistance, of love as the same force that opens a flower in spring and pulls a tree from its roots in a storm. Now settle fully into where you are. Release the weight of the day from your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. Let the room around you recede. We are traveling back through time to the dark wine-colored waters of the Eastern Sea, to a period before Greece existed as an idea, to the moment when the ocean itself produced something no one had a name for yet. The later poets needed it to be gentle. They shaped the story into something a person could hold without being burned. A soft emergence, a figure rising serenely from still water, carried on a shell by warm breezes, greeted by dancing nymphs and birdsong and morning light. They painted it over and over and called it radiance, called it the arrival of all loveliness into a world that had been patiently waiting. But the older telling was more honest. Hesiod, the shepherd poet who claimed the muses, had pressed words into him like stones into wet clay, wrote the full ancestral record of the gods without softening a single edge. He told the story of Aphrodite not as a birth, but as a consequence. Not as a beginning, but as a transformation. The process by which an act of enormous violence becomes something the universe has never encountered before. The weapon had been shaped from adamant, the hardest material existence contains. When Kronos swung it through the ancient darkness, divine flesh parted as easily as still water parts around a stone dropped into it. Oranos, the sky made into a body, the primal father of everything that would come after, had descended each night since the first night, spreading himself across Gaia the earth in an embrace that was simultaneously union and imprisonment. All the children born from that joining, the Titans, the Cyclopes, the 100-armed ones, had been forced back into the earth's body, pushed down into the deep caverns beneath the ground, because the sky was terrified of what his own children might eventually become. Gaia had endured this for as long as endurance was possible. But even the earth has a limit. The severed flesh fell through the newly created space between sky and ground, a gap that Kronos' blade had essentially invented, that had not existed the moment before. It struck the surface of the sea near the island of Cythera, and the ocean should have swallowed it, should have drawn it down into lightless water and kept it there. But the sea recognized what it had received, not mortal tissue, something saturated with the original power of creation, still warm from the first moments of the world's existence, still carrying the force that had held the cosmos in shape since before there was a cosmos to hold. The foam that rose was unlike ordinary foam. It held its own light. It spread outward in widening rings across the surface, white as the interior of a flame, bright as the moon reflected in deep, still water. And within that spreading brightness, something was taking shape, not drifting into a shape by accident, moving toward one with clear intention. The sea had never made a deity before. That was the domain of sky meeting earth, of ancient powers joined in the old way. But the sea was older than any of those arrangements. The sea remembered the first water, the formless dark that preceded light and shadow, that existed before and after had any meaning. And the sea understood something that none of the other elemental forces understood: how to take what has been shattered and return it transformed, not repaired, not reconstructed, remade into something better suited for what the world was about to require. She emerged the way a certainty arrives, not gradually, but all at once, complete and fully formed, with no infancy behind her and no gradual learning ahead of her. She was simply present, the way the first morning was simply present, the way gravity was simply present, the way longing existed before anyone had developed a word for it. Her hair carried the color of honey and late afternoon sunlight, still wet, droplets scattered across it, catching the rising dawn like fragments of something precious. Her skin held the specific luminescence of a pearl's inner surface, of shells, of things that develop in darkness without ever losing their light. Her eyes were the color of deep ocean, not the bright, obvious blue of shallow coastal water, but the dark, secretive blue of the abyss, the color that implies enormous depth and the presence of things not yet named. Her beauty was not a matter of features arranged in pleasing proportion. It was not something that could be measured against other beautiful things and declared superior. It was an event. It was what happened to anyone who encountered her, breath leaving the body, the heartbeat losing its reliable rhythm, the ordinary machinery of the mind suddenly running in a register it had never used before. The Greeks would develop a single word for this particular quality: thama, a vision so overwhelming it crosses the threshold from the aesthetic into the territory of the sacred. An encounter that does not merely please, but undoes. She was beauty as weather, beauty as a force with its own will, beauty as something that does not need permission to exist or to affect everything around it. The foam clung to her as she moved, reluctant to release her. She took one step, and the water beneath her solidified just enough to carry weight. Then another step, and another, and she was walking across the open sea as though it were a marble floor, leaving a trail of pale froth and impossible flowers behind her. Cythera received her first, a small island of rock and wind, unclaimed by any particular god's attention. But the moment her foot pressed into its shore, the stone seemed to soften. Grass pushed up through surfaces that had held nothing but gray rock. Flowers opened where there had been only bare ground, myrtle and roses, violets and anemones, species that had never existed before that precise instant, as though the earth was attempting to produce something worthy of her. The air changed around her. It thickened with a scent that had no existing name, something between sea salt and opening blossoms, between warm soil and high clear air. It was a fragrance her temples would later fill themselves with smoke trying to approximate, though no mortal perfumer would ever quite arrive at it. It was the scent of wanting itself, of the held breath before something irrevocable, of the particular space between reaching and touching. The Horai found her there, the goddesses of the seasons, daughters of Zeus and Themis, the ones responsible for time's right order. They had felt something shift in the fabric of things, a new presence, a disturbance with no category. They came to the shore of Cythera and stopped, rendered wordless by what stood before them. She stood among the flowers she had called into existence, unhurried and unashamed, sea foam still resting in the waves of her hair. And she regarded the Horai the way something ancient regards something newer, without anxiety, without any need for their approval. As an equal, or perhaps as something that had existed before them and would continue long after. The Horai, who were never at a loss, found they had nothing to say. The eldest finally stepped forward, carrying a robe that appeared to be woven from the quality of dawn itself, from mist and the first thin warmth of morning. She draped it over the newcomer's shoulders, and the fabric settled as though it had been held in reserve for this specific moment. One goddess set a golden circlet in her hair. Another fastened a belt around her waist, not an ordinary one, but something that seemed to carry its own dim light, something that pulsed faintly as though alive. Later poets would call it the Kestos Hemas, and say it contained every power of attraction woven into its threads. But it was not a gift, not something being added to her from outside. It was simply a visible rendering of what was already present, an outer sign of an inner force. The west wind Zephyros arrived then, curious and light, as he always was. He had carried many things across the water in his long existence: ships, seeds, songs, but never a goddess. She stepped into the current of him without hesitation, and he lifted her as gently as he would lift a leaf, carrying her over the dark water toward the edge of where the mortal world began. But she did not go to Greece, not yet. Zephyros carried her to Cyprus, the great island that lay between Greece and the ancient East, Phoenicia, Assyria, Babylon, Cyprus, where mountains broke sharply from the sea and valleys ran thick with cedar and pine. Cyprus, where merchants from dozens of different worlds came to trade copper and dye. bringing with them their own stories of their own sacred powers. The people of Cyprus already knew a great goddess. They called her Astarte, and they said she had arrived from the east, from the old cities of Sidon and Tyre. She was the goddess of love and war simultaneously, of fertility and ruin, of the morning star that announces the day and the evening star that closes it. They had built her temples on high ground and brought her incense and doves, honey and wine. When Aphrodite stepped onto the shore of Cyprus, near the place that would one day be called Paphos, the people there recognized her immediately, not as a stranger, but as something returning. As though the goddess they had always honored had finally decided to appear in her actual form. They fell to their knees. Some wept. They sang in languages she had never heard and understood completely. And they raised her a temple not of wood or mud brick, but of stone, massive, enduring, with an altar that would hold sacred fire for 1,000 years. But this altar contained no statue, no carved woman in marble. At its center stood a dark conical stone, a beetleus, a piece of sky that had fallen to earth in the time before memory, because the people of Cyprus understood something that later civilizations would lose, that she was not merely a woman, even a divine one. She was a force, something that could not be fully captured in human shape. The smoke of offerings rose around the stone at Paphos, myrrh and frankincense, cinnamon and spikenard, perfumes from the ancient East where the goddess had first been known. And Aphrodite stood in the doorway of her temple and breathed in the smoke and understood that this was her place, that this island, this shore, this particular quality of light on water was the closest thing she had to a home. She had come into being through violence. She had risen from the sea. She had been dressed by the seasons and carried by the wind and recognized by a people who had been waiting for her without knowing they were waiting. Now it was time for Olympus. Time to meet the gods who believed themselves the final authority over everything. Time to show them that certain powers predate their authority entirely and will outlast it. The sea continued its breathing behind her, foam building and dissolving on the shore. And in that rhythm, in that endless cycle of making and unmaking, her fundamental nature was written. She had not been born to establish order. She had not been born to bring peace. She had been born to remind the world that beneath every careful structure, beneath every law and boundary that gods and mortals raise against chaos, something remains that cannot be governed. Desire, the force that draws everything toward everything else, the force that constructs and the force that dismantles. She was its living face. Olympus was not simply a mountain, though it was that too, the tallest peak in Greece, its summit perpetually lost in cloud. It was also a realm, a dimension, a place that existed both within the world and outside it, where the gods had raised their great halls after defeating the Titans and claiming dominion over sky and sea and earth. The halls were built from materials with no names in any mortal language. The columns were something between marble and concentrated starlight. floors seemed to reflect both the sky above and the earth below simultaneously. The air itself was thinner and clearer, and charged with an energy that would have been unbearable to any human body. This was the seat of the new order. Zeus sat at its center, king of gods and men, the one who had unseated his own father the way his father had unseated his, the one who believed he had finally broken the cycle and built something that would endure. He was mistaken. The first to sense her approach was Hermes, the messenger, the one who understood crossings and thresholds, and the spaces between one thing and another better than any other god. He felt something shift in the air far below, something carried on the wind that was more than wind. He looked down from the edge of Olympus and watched her climbing the mountain slope. Zephyros had set her gently at the base, and she was ascending now, not struggling, not working for each step, but rising through the altitude as easily as if the mountain were level ground. The Horai walked beside her, but clearly as attendants, not as equals. They were there to present her, to ensure the gods above understood the significance of what was arriving. Hermes watched and felt something he had not felt in the whole of his long existence, the particular unease that comes from encountering something you cannot categorize. She was not a Titan. Those elder forces had been imprisoned in Tartarus. She was not an Olympian. She had taken no part in the war that had established the current order. She was not a nymph, not a lesser spirit, not anything that fit within the established architecture of divine existence. She was something without a category. He turned and moved back toward the throne room faster than thought. The gods were gathered, as they so often were. Zeus on his throne, Hera at his side, Poseidon and Hades visiting from their own domains, Athena in her full armor, Apollo with his lyre, Artemis with her bow, Ares reclining with a cup of wine as though prepared for a long, comfortable wait, Hephaestus working quietly in the corner on something intricate and precise. Hermes announced that someone was approaching, someone new. And the word new landed strangely in a room of immortals who had not encountered anything new in a very long time. Before anyone could form a complete response, the great doors of the throne room moved, not thrown open dramatically, not broken down. They simply parted, the way two people step aside for something they instinctively understand outranks them. And she walked in. The effect was instantaneous and total. Every voice stopped. Every gesture froze. Every divine being in that hall turned toward her simultaneously, as though pulled by a single string. Apollo, who had watched the sun rise over every edge of the world since the beginning of time, who had witnessed every variety of light and beauty the world could produce, felt his fingers go slack on the lyre strings. He, who had always understood illumination, found himself suddenly uncertain what that word had ever meant. Ares, who charged into the worst of battles laughing, who had never encountered a force he could not meet with an equal counterforce, felt something move through his chest that was not fear, but was equally ungovernable. A hunger so total and so physical that it bordered on pain. Poseidon, lord of oceans, felt the salt water in his own body respond to her presence the way the sea responds to the moon, pulled, oriented, unable to look away from what was calling it. Hephaestus, who could make anything from raw material, who had spent his entire divine existence in the confident domain of craft and construction, looked at her and understood for the first time that some things cannot be made, only found, only encountered, only fallen before. Athena, whose gray eyes missed nothing and classified everything, looked at the newcomer and felt a cold, precise recognition move through her. Not of a friend, of a force that operated by entirely different rules. Something that could not be outmaneuvered by strategy or intelligence, because it did not engage with strategy or intelligence at all. It went underneath them, around them, directly to something older and less rational in everyone it touched. Artemis, who had sworn herself to independence and solitude, who belonged to no one and intended to keep it that way, felt an immediate instinctive recoil. She recognized in this arrival the exact opposite of everything she had built her divine identity on. Where Artemis was sovereignty, this was union. Where Artemis was self-contained, this was the force that dissolves all containment. Where Artemis was the dignity of standing alone, this was the pull toward merging with something beyond yourself, whether you consented to it or not. And Hera, queen of Olympus, the goddess who protected the marriage bond and the sanctity of the household, looked at Aphrodite and understood with immediate cold certainty that the most significant threat she would ever face had just walked through her door. Zeus rose from his throne, something he did rarely, something that signaled the weight of a moment, and his voice carried its familiar resonance of gathered storm. But for the first time in longer than memory, there was something else underneath the authority, something that felt uncomfortably like uncertainty. He learned her name. He learned what she was. And while the political mind in him moved quickly through the implications, cataloging the complications and the necessary responses, the other part of him, the part that he governed so carefully and so publicly, felt the same undertow that was pulling every other god in the hall. He looked at her and felt his own control beginning to slip, and he saw in her eyes that she knew it. She was doing nothing to cause it. She was simply being what she was, with no performance and no effort. And she was fully, calmly, completely aware of the effect. This was the moment Zeus understood the full scale of the problem. Every god in the room was caught in the same current. He could see it in the quality of their attention, the way their bodies inclined subtly toward her, the way every other thing in the room had stopped mattering. If he did nothing, they would move against each other over her. The new order he had spent the entire length of his reign constructing would fracture along lines he had not anticipated. He needed to redirect this, contain it, attach it to something stable. His mind moved through the options and landed on the one possibility that carried no threat to his own position. One god who was gifted, but not ambitious in any way that endangered the throne. One god who was loyal and skilled, and whose particular nature would ensure he could never use a powerful alliance to challenge the existing order. He looked at Hephaestus, the smith god, the craftsman, the one who had been thrown from the mountain as an infant and had returned and earned his place entirely through the quality of his work, through making beautiful and necessary things for everyone else. Hephaestus, who was at this moment looking at Aphrodite with an expression so unguarded it was almost unbearable to witness. Zeus made the decree. Hephaestus would take Aphrodite as his wife. The wedding would happen the following day. The room erupted. Ares surged upright. Apollo went still in the particular way of someone swallowing a loss they have no right to argue against. And Aphrodite stood perfectly motionless through all of it, her expression revealing nothing. She looked at Zeus, then at Hephaestus, then at Zeus again. She offered no argument, no appeal. She simply regarded the king of the gods with those deep, ocean-colored eyes, and Zeus felt a cold certainty settle in his chest, because he understood in that instant that he had not actually solved anything. He had made a move in a game he did not fully understand, and she had already seen past it to whatever came next. Hephaestus, oblivious to everything moving beneath the surface of the moment, was overwhelmed with a gratitude so genuine and so total that it was painful for everyone else in the room to look at. He did not understand that he was not being rewarded. He was being used as a lock. Zeus later understood, with the slow sinking certainty of a man watching an inevitable thing arrive, that he had just made a serious and probably irreversible mistake. He had tried to hold the sea in place with a rope of words. He had tried to impose structure on something that had existed before structure, that would outlast it, that was constitutionally incapable of being governed by any external authority. The sea does not hold still. Desire does not obey decrees. And a goddess born from violence and salt water would not be contained by any king's decision. The wedding was arranged and executed with the cold efficiency of a military campaign, because Hera understood that that was exactly what it was, a strategic intervention dressed in the language of celebration. The great hall was dressed in perfect flowers. The music was technically flawless. The light fell through the columns at exactly the right angles, but there was no actual warmth anywhere in it. Even the nymphs who sang the ceremonial hymns seemed subdued, as though they could feel the wrongness of what they were being asked to celebrate. Hephaestus stood at the altar in his finest clothing, his uneven gait hidden as much as the architecture of his body allowed, his forge-scarred hands clasped in front of him. He had bathed in the sacred springs. He had oiled his hair. He had done everything within his power to make himself presentable, to be worthy of what he understood as a profound gift, because that was genuinely how he understood it. The king of the gods had looked at him, at Hephaestus, the lame one, the cast-out one, the one who had been thrown from the mountain before he could walk, and had crawled back through skill alone, and had deemed him deserving of the most extraordinary being in existence. He did not see that he was not being honored. He was being positioned. Aphrodite entered the hall, and the room's attention moved to her automatically, the way a compass needle moves to north. She wore a robe the color of deep-sea water, shifting as she moved between blue and silver, and the pale, translucent green of light filtered through shallow waves. Her hair was held with golden pins shaped like leaping dolphins. The Kestos hemas pulsed with its quiet light at her waist. She walked the full length of the hall unaccompanied. There was no father to present her, no family to release her, because she had come from no family in any conventional sense. She had come from the sea itself, from the violence of a severed god and the memory of the first water. She walked with her head level and her expression as still as open ocean on a windless day. She neither reached toward what was ahead nor pulled away from it. She simply moved through the space as something that understood it had no choice about this particular moment. But that a moment is not forever. The ceremony proceeded. The libations were poured. The ancient words were spoken. Hands were bound together with golden cord, his calloused, and burned from 1,000 long nights at the forge, hers cool and smooth as the inside of a shell. The contrast was visible, and the watching was difficult. It was done. The celebration that followed was elaborate and deeply uncomfortable. The gods ate and drank, but the loud open joy that usually moved through an Olympian feast was absent. Ares sat apart, cup in hand, his attention never leaving Aphrodite. Apollo played music that came out sadder than he intended and eventually stopped. Artemis left early without explanation. Hephaestus was the only one in the room who seemed genuinely happy. He sat beside his new wife and offered her the finest foods and most fragrant wines, tried to draw something from her, tried to find the opening through which a real exchange might begin. She accepted everything with courteous grace and offered very little in return. When the feast finally ended, Hephaestus brought Aphrodite to the home he had built specifically for her, set apart from the main halls of Olympus, close to the forge that was his truest domain. In the single day between Zeus's announcement and the wedding, he had worked without stopping, without eating, without sleeping, pouring every gram of his talent into creating a space worthy of her. The walls were bronze inlaid with gold and silver in intricate depictions of the act of making. The furniture was carved from the rarest woods and set with precious stones. The sleeping room was draped with linen, so fine it had been woven by the Graces themselves. She moved through the rooms slowly, trailing her fingers across each surface, examining his work with the eye of someone who understands beauty when they encounter it. She paused at certain pieces longer than others. She was fair in her assessment. Everything was extraordinary, and she was willing to recognize that. But the space between them, in that house, felt wider than the sea. What followed was an exchange of pure honesty, perhaps the most honest conversation either of them would ever have. She told him what he was and what he was not with cruelty, but with the terrible gentleness of someone who has decided not to perform. She was not a gift to be awarded, not a mechanism for managing political unease on Olympus, not a possession to be assigned by a king who was afraid of what she represented. She told him that his goodness was real, his skill, his loyalty, his genuine decency. These things were not small, but they were not sufficient. Love was not a reward for correct behavior. It was not a transaction. It did not arrive at the end of enough effort and faithfulness as a prize. It was either present or it was not. Between them, it was not. And he, in the quiet that followed, showed himself to be more perceptive than Zeus had accounted for. He understood that she was not being cruel. She was being what she was, a force of nature, a living embodiment of desire, something that could no more be held to a marriage contract than fire could be held in a paper vessel. But he also made his own position clear. He would not prevent her from being what she was. He would not perform contentment. And if he discovered specifics, if she was careless enough to let evidence reach him, he would respond. He was the god of the forge. He understood how to build things that held. She received this not as a threat, but as a fair accounting. They understood each other, perhaps more clearly than most paired beings ever manage, even those who love each other genuinely. It was not love, but it was honest. And in the world of the gods, where deception and performance were the daily currency of power, honesty was rare and worth something. He left her the room he had built for her and went to sleep at the forge, as he had so many times before. Aphrodite stood alone in the beautiful house and looked out toward the sea, toward the distant edge of the world where the mortal realm lay beneath the stars, somewhere beyond Zeus's decrees and Hera's cold oversight, beyond the fiction of this arrangement she had never agreed to. There was freedom. She would find it. She would take it. She would remind the world what it means to encounter something that cannot be governed. The sea does not apologize for the tide. The wind asks no one's permission. Desire does not bow to the laws of kings. The affair began the way these things always begin, not with a grand announcement, but with a single held glance across a crowded room. 3 months after the wedding, the gods gathered for one of their celebrations. The wine moved freely, the music was loud, and the usual sharp hierarchies of Olympus softened slightly in the warmth of the occasion. Aphrodite sat beside Hephaestus, maintaining the performance of wife. She smiled at the expected moments. She received compliments with gracious acknowledgement. She did everything the occasion required, but her attention was somewhere else. Ares watched her from across the hall. Ares, the god of war, of the moment when every civilized thing collapses and the animal underneath takes over. He was not beloved by the other Olympians. Zeus found him useful and distasteful in equal measure. Athena despised him as the embodiment of everything her own domain stood against. He was tall and powerfully built, his body a tool shaped entirely for violence, his presence carrying the constant low charge of something about to detonate. He had wanted Aphrodite from the moment she arrived on Olympus. Unlike the others who had concealed their wanting behind poetry or political maneuvering, he had simply told her directly she should be with him because they were the same thing: love and war, the two forces that strip mortals of reason and caution and self-preservation, the two powers that make people forget everything they know in favor of what they feel. He had argued that they belonged together. She had smiled a real smile and told him not yet. 3 months of watching her sit beside the wrong god had done nothing to diminish the argument. Now their eyes met across the hall, and it was not a tender glance. It was the recognition that passes between two things that are the same kind of dangerous. Two forces of nature acknowledging each other without pretense or performance. The specific look that passes between a storm and an open sea. She slipped out of the hall. He followed. He found her in a garden beneath an olive tree, looking up at the stars. What passed between them there, in the cool, jasmine-scented dark, was not soft or careful. It was the meeting of fire and oil, of two forces that have no business combining, but that, once combined, produce something impossible to contain. They became lovers that night, and it was everything her life at Olympus was not. Desire without apology. Power meeting power without hierarchy. Two divine beings encountering each other as equals, without the weight of transaction or performance, or the exhausting requirement to be something other than what they were. Lying in the cool grass afterward, Aphrodite felt something she had not experienced since she first stepped from the sea, the specific and irreplaceable sensation of being entirely herself. They believed they were careful. They met in different locations, varied their timing, maintained their appearances at public gatherings. And for a while, it seemed to hold. But there was one who saw everything. Helios, the Titan god of the sun, had been permitted to keep his role after the Olympians came to power. He had remained neutral in the war, and Zeus had let him continue driving his golden chariot across the sky from horizon to horizon each day. From that height, Helios witnessed everything. The private acts of mortals, the secret arrangements of gods, the hidden places where those who should not meet came together anyway. He saw Aphrodite and Ares in the garden. He saw them in a cave by the sea. He saw them in a grove thick with shadow, where they clearly believed the dark would hide them. He said nothing, because it was not his business to enter Olympian disputes. But Hephaestus had once done something for him, had forged a new chariot unprompted, lighter and faster than the old one. with wheels that required no maintenance and reins that responded to the lightest touch. He had accepted no payment and asked for no recognition. He had simply done it as one craftsman acknowledging the work of another. Helios remembered. One day, as his chariot passed over the forge, he descended and delivered the truth plainly. Aphrodite was with Ares, and most often they used Hephaestus's own house, his own bed, while he worked through the night at his fires. The hammer in Hephaestus's hand went still on the anvil. He stood without moving for a long moment. Then he set the hammer down carefully and said what needed to be said, and Helios drove on. Hephaestus returned to his forge, but he was no longer working on the piece he had started. He was working on something new. He worked for days without rest, without eating, without sleeping. The forge fires burned higher than they had in years. The hammer rang against the anvil in a rhythm that sounded almost like a second heartbeat, faster and more urgent than the first. And slowly, with the full devotion of his enormous skill turned toward a single purpose, he produced the most extraordinary thing he had ever made. A net, not an ordinary net. This was woven from threads of adamant, the same unbreakable substance from which Kronos' weapon had been forged. But the threads were so fine as to be nearly invisible, so light that the whole structure could be lifted in one hand, and so strong that no force, divine or otherwise, could separate them once they had closed around something. He carried it home. He climbed a ladder and attached it to the ceiling above the bed, using a mechanism only he could have designed. Connected by a hidden cord to a trigger point he could reach from outside the room. He told Aphrodite he would be working late. She nodded. He left. He did not go to the forge. He hid nearby in the dark, and he waited. Ares arrived after nightfall. He moved through Hephaestus's house with the casual ease of someone who had been there many times. Aphrodite arrived shortly after. The sounds that reached Hephaestus from the room he had built for her contained every humiliation he had tried to prepare himself for. He waited until the moment was certain. Then he pulled the cord. The net descended without a sound, and by the time either of them understood what was happening, the adamantine threads had already wrapped around them both, pulling tighter with every movement, binding them together in a tangle they could not escape. Ares, who had broken armies, could not break these threads. Aphrodite, who had slipped free of every constraint the world had ever tried to place on her, could not find a way through. They were held. Hephaestus walked into the room and looked at them. He said what he had come to say, not with rage, but with the flat, precise delivery of someone who has thought through every word in advance. He had not done this out of jealousy over the act itself. He had expected the act, but she had not had to do it here, in this house, in the room he had built for her. That had been unkind. That had been the addition of contempt to an arrangement he had already accepted at considerable cost. Then he went to Olympus. He stood before Zeus's throne, and invited every god in the hall to come and see what had been happening inside his marriage. Because he asked for so little, and because the particular quality of his voice was something they had never heard from him before, they came. What they found when they arrived, the god of war and the goddess of love, divine and naked and utterly helpless, bound in a net of invisible thread, produced very different reactions. The male gods laughed. The laughter was loud and relieved, the laughter of people who have been holding tension for a long time and suddenly have permission to release it. The female gods did not laugh. Hera's face held the specific cold satisfaction of vindication. Athena's carried sharp judgment. Artemis turned away without a word. Zeus looked at the scene with the exhausted expression of someone watching the exact catastrophe they had most wanted to prevent play out in front of them anyway. Poseidon, practical as always, offered to stand surety for the fine that Ares would owe for adultery. Hephaestus accepted the guarantee and released the net. Ares dressed in silence and left without meeting anyone's eyes. Aphrodite stood and faced the assembled gods and looked at each of them in turn, the laughing ones with calm contempt, the judging ones with something that refused to be called shame. And when she looked at Hephaestus, something moved through her expression that was genuinely close to respect. The specific respect that goes to someone who has surprised you. She acknowledged, quietly and without excess, that she had been unkind. Not in the taking of a lover, he had known she would do that, but in the specific choice of venue. That had been unnecessary cruelty, and she recognized it as such. From Aphrodite, in that moment, it was as close to an apology as she was constitutionally capable of giving. Zeus declared the matter concluded. The fine would be paid. Aphrodite would be more careful in the future. Hephaestus had received his accounting. They would all proceed and collectively pretend none of it had occurred. But of course it had occurred, and no one would forget it. The story spread and was retold as comedy by some, as tragedy by others. But everyone who told it recognized the same truth at its center. Desire cannot be governed. Passion moves through every wall. Even the most precisely engineered trap holds its prisoners only briefly before they return to their nature. Hephaestus stood alone in his house afterward, looking at the net on the floor, at the evidence of everything he had built and everything he had lost. He had won something, a kind of public justice, the acknowledgement that he was not powerless, proof that even the god of the forge could respond to betrayal with something more sophisticated than grief. But he had not won her. He had never won her. And no net, however precisely made, would change that. You cannot trap the sea. A goddess born from violence and foam will always find a way through. There are moments in the life of the world when a single act, driven by a single emotion, sets in motion a chain of consequence that reshapes everything downstream from it. This was one of those moments, though no one standing in its early presence understood the full scale of what was beginning. It started not with a declaration or a divine pronouncement, but with a wedding invitation. More precisely, with the absence of one. The marriage of Peleus and Thetis should have been a moment of rare and genuine celebration. Peleus was a mortal hero of authentic valor, favored by the gods for his courage and his piety. Thetis was a Nereid, a sea nymph of extraordinary power, daughter of Nereus, the old man of the sea. She had been desired by Zeus himself and by Poseidon until the Titan Prometheus disclosed a prophecy that altered everything. Any son born to Thetis would be greater than his father. If Zeus fathered that child would eventually unseat him, continuing the cycle of divine overthrow that had defined every generation before. Zeus, for once choosing foresight over want, arranged for Thetis to marry a mortal instead. The children she bore would be magnificent, but human, mortal enough to pose no threat to the divine order. The wedding was held on Mount Pelion in a sacred grove, where the boundary between mortal and divine ran thin enough for both worlds to mingle. All the gods were invited. All the gods except one. Eris, the goddess of discord, had been deliberately excluded. It was Zeus's direct decision. He knew what she brought with her wherever she went, not the open violence of war, but the more patient and penetrating damage of jealousy and comparison, and the small, cruel word lodged in exactly the right place. She was not welcome at celebrations, and no one had taken a moment to consider what her response to that exclusion might be. They should have thought it through. Eris stood in the shadows at the edge of the sacred grove and watched the celebration she had not been invited to. She watched the gods feasting and laughing. She watched the perfect harmony of the occasion. She felt the familiar, specific burn of being deemed unfit for the company of those who created her. Then she reached into her robes and drew out an apple. It looked like a golden fruit from the gardens of the Hesperides, perfect, luminous, the kind of thing that should belong to something immortal. But it had been made by Eris herself, shaped for a single purpose. She took a small blade and carved 3 words into its skin. To the fairest, she smiled the smile of someone who has just set something in motion that cannot be recalled. Then she stepped briefly from the shadows, rolled the apple into the middle of the feast, and disappeared back into the dark. The apple came to rest at the feet of the assembled gods. Silence, everyone looking at it, at the inscription, at each other. Then Hera picked it up and read the words aloud in a careful, neutral voice, while her eyes moved quickly around the gathering, and declared with absolute certainty that it was obviously meant for her. She was the queen of the gods. Who else could the designation possibly apply to? Before the words had settled, Athena rose and offered the counterargument that beauty was not a function of rank, that the highest form of grace came from the union of wisdom and strength, that she embodied the civilizing ideal, and therefore the apple belonged to her by any fair assessment. And from across the gathering came Aphrodite's voice, clear and entirely unhurried, pointing out that both of them were mistaken. She was the goddess of beauty itself, the living form of desire and attraction. The apple had no possible other destination. The three goddesses stood looking at each other, and the air between them crackled with something that had nothing to do with celebration. Zeus understood immediately. This was not a gift. It was a weapon. Someone had introduced poison into the occasion, and it was already spreading through the company like wine through water. There was no path through this that left all three goddesses satisfied, and he knew it. He needed a judge who was not an Olympian and could not be accused of bias. Someone whose decision the three goddesses would accept, or at least someone who could absorb the consequences when the decision went against two of them. His mind went to a young shepherd on Mount Ida, in the hills above Troy. A young man known throughout the region for his ability to look at any dispute with clear eyes and render a judgment that all parties recognized as genuinely fair. Paris would judge. His decision would be final. Hermes was given the charge with an expression that suggested he understood that some messages should never be delivered. But the messenger carried the messages he was given. He took the apple from Hera's reluctant hand and led the three goddesses toward the mortal world, and Aphrodite followed with the calm certainty of someone who already knows how the story ends. They found Paris in a wildflower meadow on the slopes of Mount Ida, watching a small flock of sheep with the easy attention of someone entirely at peace with the shape of his days. He was young and clear-eyed, and had the natural bearing of someone with divine ancestry somewhere upstream in his lineage, which was accurate in ways he did not yet know. Hermes descended from the sky and delivered the formal charge. Paris was to judge which of these three goddesses deserved the golden apple inscribed to the fairest, and his decision would be binding. Paris took the apple with trembling hands and looked at the three figures before him, and understood immediately that he had been asked to do something that no person, mortal or otherwise, could do cleanly. Each of them was beautiful in a fundamentally different register. Hera was the beauty of authority, of power so total it reshapes the space around it. Athena was the beauty of absolute precision, of a mind and body operating in perfect alignment. Aphrodite was the beauty of pure wanting, the force that empties a mind of everything except itself. Before he could speak, Hera stepped forward and laid out her offer. Choose her, and she would make him the most powerful man in the mortal world. Kingdoms, dominion, a name carved into the memory of history for all time. Power that would outlast his body. Athena followed with the counteroffer. Power without wisdom is a structure with no foundation. Choose her instead, and she would give him a mind sharper than any weapon. Victory in every strategy. Glory that would never fade. The kind of heroic legacy that poets would would carry forward for generations. Then Aphrodite moved forward, and she did not outline a political abstraction. She looked at him directly, in the particular way she looked at people. And when she finally spoke, her voice was almost quiet, not a proclamation, but a confidence. Something shared between two people rather than announced to a crowd. She spoke about what was missing from both of the offers that had preceded hers. Power held alone, glory with no one to turn to in the night. And then she offered him something else entirely. She offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus, whose beauty was said to belong to a register beyond the ordinary, who was already the wife of a king, but who would, through Aphrodite's intercession, become his. Paris stood in the meadow with the apple in his hand and felt three entirely different futures pressing against him simultaneously. He thought about it for the time it takes a cloud to cross the sun. Then he held the apple out to Aphrodite. She took it with a smile that contained triumph and something older and darker below the surface of the triumph. The specific satisfaction of someone who knew the outcome before the question was asked. Hera's face became stone. She promised that the mortal now standing before her had made an enemy with a very long memory. Athena's response was almost sorrowful in its precision. She told him that he had chosen the short answer over the true one, and that when his city burned and the people he loved were ashes, he should return in his mind to this meadow and remember that wisdom would have kept them alive. They both vanished. Hermes lingered a moment, looked at Paris with something recognizable as pity, said quietly that the boy should have refused the whole thing, that no mortal could have been expected to make this judgment cleanly, that the fates might be merciful, though the gods would not. Then he too was gone. Paris stood alone in the meadow with the golden apple, and a feeling he did not yet have a name for the first cold premonition of what he had just set in motion. He did not know yet that he was a prince. He did not know that within 6 months he would be recognized and welcomed back to Troy. He did not know about Helen or the fleet or the 10 years of fire that would follow, but all of that was coming, and he would remember this meadow. The recognition arrived during funeral games held in honor of a royal child. Paris had been invited to compete as an unknown shepherd, and he won every event he entered, including contests against the sons of Priam himself. The king, impressed, invited this unknown young man to receive his prizes in the palace. It was there that an old servant looked at the face of the shepherd and went very still, and the truth came out in a rush of weeping and disbelief. This was the infant Priam, and Hecuba had ordered left on the mountain to die. The child of the dream prophecy, the one Hecuba had seen in sleep as a flaming torch that would reduce Troy to ash. He had been left on Mount Ida and rescued by shepherds, and had grown into the man now standing in the great hall of his own palace. Priam looked at his son alive and strong, and made the decision that would doom them all. He chose love over prophecy and welcomed Paris home. He gave him back his place among the royal family. Hector, the crown prince and the greatest warrior Troy had produced, embraced his long-lost brother with genuine warmth. Cassandra, the prophetess, looked at Paris with undisguised horror and screamed warnings into the air of the palace that everyone around her chose not to hear. She had been cursed by Apollo to speak true prophecy and never be believed. And so her warnings were attributed to her illness, and the city continued its preparations. Paris adapted to royal life with surprising ease, learned quickly, and was soon being sent on diplomatic missions to neighboring kingdoms. One such mission took him to Sparta, to the court of Menelaus, king of Sparta, husband of Helen. The visit was a diplomatic courtesy, nothing more, a way of maintaining the bonds between Trojan and Greek houses. Priam had no reason to imagine that sending Paris to Sparta was like carrying an open flame into a room packed with dry timber. But Aphrodite had not forgotten her promise. She had been patient. She had been waiting for exactly this alignment. Paris sailed with gifts and a small retinue and was received as the sacred laws of hospitality demanded, warmly, generously, with the full dignity due to a royal guest. The laws of Xenia were absolute, protected by Zeus himself. To betray a guest or harm a host was among the gravest violations the Greek world recognized. Paris understood these laws. He had grown up in their shadow. He understood precisely what he was about to do. Then he saw Helen. She entered the hall during the welcoming feast, and everything Paris thought he understood about beauty became immediately insufficient. She was the daughter of Zeus, born from an egg, half divine, and the divine ancestry showed in every line of her face and every movement of her body, in the particular quality of how she occupied space, as though the world organized itself slightly differently around her than around everyone else. Paris looked at her and felt something shift inside him that he would never be able to shift back. He did not know that Aphrodite was working on him, amplifying what was already present, turning natural attraction into obsession, turning want into the kind of consuming necessity that causes otherwise rational people to do catastrophically irrational things. He only knew that nothing else in the world mattered in comparison to what he felt in that moment. Helen, for her own part, felt the same current the instant her eyes found him. Her husband Menelaus was a decent man and a competent king, and he treated her with respect and provided her with stability. But there was no fire in their marriage. There had never been any fire in their marriage. She had chosen him for safety, and safety, she was learning, was not the same thing as being fully alive. Aphrodite had less work to do on Helen than on Paris. Helen was already quietly restless, already asking herself in private whether a life arranged entirely around safety was a life being fully used. The goddess only needed to take what was already present in her and make it visible to her, Over the days that followed, Paris and Helen found ways to occupy the same spaces. They walked in the palace gardens. They spoke with the careful indirection of people who both know they are approaching something that cannot be reversed. Menelaus, trusting the laws of hospitality and trusting his wife, noticed nothing. He received word that he was needed in Crete for his grandfather's funeral, announced he would be gone for several weeks, and asked Helen to continue entertaining their Trojan guest in his absence. He meant it as nothing more than courtesy. Aphrodite received it as precisely the opening she needed. The night after Menelaus departed, Paris came to Helen's chambers. He was not sneaking. He walked through the palace directly, as though the laws of gods and men had simply stopped applying to him in this specific moment, which in a certain sense they had. He found her standing at the window, looking at the stars. When she turned, he saw in her face that she had been waiting, that the decision had already been made somewhere before this moment, that she had crossed a threshold in her own mind before he arrived. He offered her a different life, Troy, a queen's place, love that would not feel like a managed arrangement. Everything. Helen stood in the silence and considered everything she was about to sacrifice. Her daughter Hermione, still a child who would be left behind. Menelaus, who had never been unkind to her. The oath of Tyndaris, which bound every Greek prince who had competed for her hand to defend her marriage and punish any man who violated it. The war that would follow, the inevitable enormous weight of consequence that would descend on everyone connected to this choice. She considered all of it, and then she considered spending the rest of her life inside a marriage that fit her the way a house fits a person when it was built for someone else entirely. She told him she would come. 5 words, the beginning of everything terrible that followed. They left that night, taking gold and silver with them, sailing under cover of darkness while the harbor slept. By the time Menelaus returned from Crete and walked into his empty palace and understood what had happened, they were already beyond reach. The king's response was the response of a man who has had something taken from him by a guest he had trusted with his home and his wife, absolute and unrelenting. He called in every oath. Agamemnon, his brother and the most powerful king in Greece, took command. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his generation, joined despite a prophecy that promised he would not come home. Odysseus came reluctantly, having tried to avoid the war entirely. Every great name from every Greek kingdom assembled at Ollys, with their men and their ships. 1,000 ships, the largest military force the ancient world had assembled. One purpose. Paris and Helen arrived in Troy to complicated reception. Priam, seeing his son's happiness and encountering the reality of Helen in person, chose to shelter them and refuse the Greek demands. He declared her a princess of Troy under his protection. Any attempt to take her by force would meet the Trojan army in full. Hector looked at Helen and saw not a woman, but a catastrophe in a human shape. He argued against his father. He tried to make him see what was coming. The old king was immovable. Cassandra screamed her warnings in the streets and corridors and was heard by no one in any meaningful way. The city prepared for war. Helen moved through the palace like someone carrying a weight she had chosen but could not put down. She did not regret Paris. She could not quite reach that regret no matter how hard she tried. But she was beginning to fully understand the scale of what her choice had cost and what it would continue to cost, measured in lives she had never met and would never know. The Greeks arrived. They beached their fleet along the coast and built a camp that stretched for miles. They sent ambassadors to Troy with a simple message: return Helen, and this ends here. Priam refused. Paris refused. And the war began. It lasted 10 years. Not the clean, heroic conflict that the later poets needed to describe, but a slow, grinding siege, punctuated by moments of extreme and specific violence. Men died in the tens of thousands. Funeral fires lit the night sky through season after season. Heroes fell in sequence: Ajax, Patroclus, Hector, each death making the war worse rather than better. Because grief hardens into purpose, and purpose hardens into the inability to stop. The gods divided along lines of old grievance and new loyalty. Aphrodite worked for Paris, and the Trojans she favored. Hera and Athena, carrying the cold, undissolved fury of the apple and the hillside and the judgment that had gone against them, directed every advantage they could engineer toward the Greeks. In the 5th year, Aphrodite made an error that revealed the limits of her power with painful precision. She had been protecting Aeneas, her actual son, born from her union with the mortal Anchises, who fought on the Trojan side. During a particularly savage engagement, the Greek warrior Diomedes drove Aeneas to the ground with a stone that should have killed him. Aphrodite descended to the battlefield in visible form and tried to carry her son away from the carnage to safety. It was the act of a mother. It was also a mistake. Diomedes, operating with Athena's encouragement at his shoulder, saw the goddess on the field and did what would have been unthinkable in any other context. He drove his spear forward, and the bronze point pierced her wrist. Ichor, the golden fluid that runs through divine veins in place of blood, ran from the wound. Aphrodite dropped her son and left the battlefield, rising into the sky and returning to Olympus with her wound cradled against her chest and her composure fractured for the first time anyone could remember. Zeus looked at her without sympathy and told her the truth plainly. The battlefield was not her domain. She was the goddess of love, of desire, of the forces that work quietly and deeply and without armor. Ares and Athena understood war. She did not. Her power lived elsewhere. She should not forget it again. The word stung worse than the wound. Not because it was wrong, because it was right. She understood what he was really saying. She had a place, and she had overstepped it. And even she could be hurt and humiliated by forces she had not taken seriously enough. She returned to the war, but differently. Subtly, she worked through suggestion and timing rather than direct presence. She turned arrows aside in ways that looked like luck. She kept Paris surviving engagements that should have ended him. She maintained between him and Helen the specific quality of passion that makes everything else, duty, reason, self-preservation, the accumulating weight of consequence, feel temporarily less real than the person beside you. Helen became a figure of compounding tragedy, beautiful beyond what could be explained and resented for it in equal measure. The Trojan women blamed her for the deaths of their sons and their fathers. The Trojan men regarded her with a mixture of desire and bitterness, knowing she was the cause of their dying, unable to stop wanting her anyway. She moved through the palace like someone who understands she is both precious to the people around her and the reason for their ruin. She stood on the walls of Troy and watched men kill each other in the dust below, and understood with increasing clarity that all of it traced back to the moment she stood at a window in Sparta and said yes, and still Aphrodite would not let her leave. She had made a promise to Paris. She intended to keep it regardless of the cost. In the 10th year, Achilles fell, struck by an arrow guided by Apollo, hitting the one vulnerable point in his otherwise immortal body. The greatest Greek warrior went down. His death should have broken the Greek army. Instead, it hardened them. Odysseus, the most strategically minded of the Greeks, devised the plan that ended everything. A great hollow wooden horse, large enough to conceal a company of armed men. The Greeks would sail out of view, leaving the horse on the beach as a sacred offering. The Trojans, believing the war was finally over, would bring it into the city. In the night, the hidden warriors would emerge and open the gates. The army waiting just out of sight would enter Troy under cover of darkness. It was a plan built on understanding human nature with precision. Specifically, on knowing that people who have endured enough suffering will choose to believe what they most want to be true. It worked. The Trojans dragged the horse through their own gates. They celebrated, drank deeply, let their vigilance dissolve for the first time in a decade. Cassandra moved through the streets screaming her warnings. Laocoon hurled a spear at the horse and demanded it be burned, and was killed for his doubts when 2 enormous sea serpents emerged from the water and crushed him and his sons before the eyes of the Trojans. The gods had decided. The horse went inside. In the night, the Greeks emerged. The gates opened. The army entered with torches. Troy burned for 3 days. Aphrodite could protect individuals. She could not preserve a city. She guided Aeneas through the burning streets with his aged father on his back and his young son at his side, out through the smoke and chaos, and down to the waiting ships, toward a destiny that would eventually arrive in Italy and become the founding line of Rome. She could not save Paris. He died in the last hours of the war, struck by an arrow, and Aphrodite watched the man she had promised to Helen, the man she had shielded through 10 years of siege, finally go still. Helen was retrieved by Menelaus. He had sworn for a decade to kill her. When he finally stood before her after all that time and all that loss, he found that he could not. She was still what she had always been, and his body remembered what his grief had tried to overwrite. He took her back to Sparta. They lived together for the remainder of his mortal life in a marriage that was neither joyful nor entirely without comfort, but simply continued. Troy became ash. The Greeks sailed home to fates as ruinous as anything they had caused. Agamemnon murdered by his wife. Odysseus lost at sea for another 10 years. Ajax driven mad by grief and pride until it killed him. The war had taken everything from everyone and left very little standing on either side. All of it traceable to an apple, a meadow, a judgment, and a goddess keeping her word. Aphrodite returned to Olympus and did not speak of the war for a long time. She had kept her promise. Paris had received what he asked for, but the scale of what that promise had cost, measured in the tens of thousands of dead, in the burning city, in the decade of accumulated grief, sat with her in a way she had not anticipated. She had proven that her power could topple civilizations. She had also learned that forces, once released, cannot be recalled. That what you set in motion grows beyond your ability to direct it. That even gods cannot fully control the outcomes of their own interventions. The Trojan War became the story the ancient world told itself about itself for 3,000 years. The example philosophers reached for when they wanted to speak about the way private desire becomes public catastrophe. The way the choices of two people can become the ruin of thousands of people who had no say in the matter. At the center of it always was Aphrodite, the goddess who kept her promise, who gave Paris exactly what he wanted, who watched it consume everything he loved. She was the goddess of love. She was also, unavoidably, the goddess of what love costs. After the fall of Troy, after the fires had burned out, and the survivors had scattered to the edges of the known world, Aphrodite withdrew from mortal affairs for a time. She returned to Cyprus, to her temple at Paphos, to the island that had received her first when she stepped from the sea, to the shore where the quality of light on water was unlike anywhere else. She walked the beaches and let the waves move around her feet and breathed the salt air, and tried to locate something quieter inside herself, something that existed before Olympus and its politics and its endless cascading consequences. She was tired in a way that gods are not supposed to be, and so inevitably she fell in love. His name was Adonis. He was the most beautiful mortal man who had ever lived, or so the stories would say, though beauty has always been specific to the person encountering it. Something about him caught her attention in a way she was unprepared for. Something that made her look twice. Something that, for the first time in centuries, made her feel the pull she was accustomed to causing in others. The circumstances of his birth were painful and complicated. His mother Mirha had been cursed by Aphrodite herself, in a different season of the goddess's life for failing to properly honor her. The curse had turned Mirha's desire toward an impossible object, and in her shame and grief, she had eventually been transformed into a myrrh tree, the tree that still carries her name and her weeping in its resin. 9 months after the transformation, the bark had split open, and Adonis had been born from inside the trunk, a child of grief and transformation. Marked from his first breath, Aphrodite had found him as an infant and felt the particular guilt that comes from recognizing your own work in someone else's suffering. She had placed him in a sealed chest and given him to Persephone, queen of the underworld, for safekeeping. But Persephone, opening the chest and seeing the extraordinary child inside, had refused to give him back. A dispute had arisen between the two goddesses, and Zeus had been called in to arbitrate. His judgment: Adonis would divide his year between the two of them, spending part of it below, and part of it above, and part of it wherever his own choice directed him. As Adonis grew into a young man of extraordinary beauty, Aphrodite's interest in him shifted into something neither of them had expected. She found herself thinking about him when her attention should have been elsewhere, looking forward to the months when he would be with her, resenting every hour he spent below with Persephone. When he finally reached adulthood and chose how to spend his free portion of the year, he chose Aphrodite, and the surge of triumph she felt was almost mortal in its texture, simple and ungovernable and enormous. They became lovers, and it was a revelation. She had taken countless lovers across the centuries, gods, heroes, kings. But this was different. With Adonis, she was not exercising power or keeping a promise or performing a role. She was simply present, vulnerable in the way that mortals are vulnerable, with all the irrationality and openness that entails. She neglected her usual responsibilities. She stopped attending the gatherings on Olympus. She spent her time with him on Cyprus, hunting together through forests and meadows, talking about everything and nothing, lying in clearings carpeted with flowers. She felt something she had not felt since the morning she rose from the sea, the sensation of being entirely herself, without performance, without armor, but underneath the happiness, in the way that immortals always know underneath, even when they are trying not to. She understood that this joy had a shape, and that shape had an ending. Mortals do not last. Any love between the immortal and the human is constitutionally unequal. She tried not to think about it. She tried to stay inside each day without letting the knowledge of future days diminish it. She warned him about hunting, about the most dangerous animals, the boar, the lion, the bear, about the gap between confidence and invincibility, which is a gap that the young and mortal are constitutionally unable to perceive in themselves. He would listen and promise care, and then go out into the forest with his spear anyway, because he was young and mortal, and the young mortal body is built to feel immortal even when the evidence suggests otherwise. There came a day when when Aphrodite was called away to Olympus for matters she could not avoid, and Adonis went hunting alone. He tracked a boar. He threw his spear and hit true, wounding deeply, and the boar, maddened with pain, beyond any capacity for ordinary response, turned and charged. Adonis ran. The boar was faster. Its tusks caught him in the thigh and tore through the great vessel there. He fell into the long grass of a clearing he had loved, and he understood with the specific clarity that comes in those moments that he was dying. He called her name. Aphrodite, already halfway to Olympus, felt the call like a blow to the center of her chest. She turned and flew back towards Cyprus at a speed she had never moved before. She found him in the clearing, lying in a spreading pool of his own blood, face pale and already taking on the particular distance of the nearly gone. The boar long fled. Adonis alone in the forest he had known since childhood. She fell to her knees beside him and gathered him into her arms. And for the first time since she rose from the sea, she wept. Her tears fell onto his chest and into the earth beside him. And where they fell, flowers grew from the soil. Anemones, small and red, the color of blood and tears combined. The earth producing something from grief, as it always does when it can. He looked up at her and tried to smile. Even now, even dying, he tried to reassure her. He told her she could not have stopped it. She was a goddess, but she was not all of creation. Some things simply happen. Some things are simply the shape of a life. His eyes closed. His breathing stopped. She held him for a long time after, in the clearing surrounded by the flowers that had grown from her weeping, learning from the inside what she had caused in others across centuries, finally experiencing what it meant to be on the receiving end of the force she had always wielded outward. Eventually, she laid him down gently among the anemones. She went to the underworld and she negotiated. Persephone, who had also loved Adonis in her way, agreed to a compromise. He would spend half the year below, as all the dead must. The other half he would be permitted to return, not quite alive as he had been, but present in the world he had loved. It was not what she wanted. It was what was available. The myth of Adonis became one of the most important in her worship. A story about love and loss, about the cycle of death and return, about the way that beauty is always temporary, and the temporariness is precisely what makes it worth something. Across the Greek world, women celebrated the Adonia every year. They planted quick-growing gardens in shallow pots, seeds that sprouted rapidly and withered in the summer heat, brief and vivid as the life they memorialized. They mourned publicly in the streets, carrying images of the young man and singing laments, then sent the images into rivers or the sea, returning him to the dark, acknowledging the cycle of loss and return. Aphrodite participated in that mourning. She appeared in the dreams of her worshippers during the Adonia, sharing the grief openly, allowing herself to be seen as something that had suffered rather than only as something that caused suffering. She became, through this story, more complex in the eyes of those who worshipped her, more human, more worthy of sympathy alongside the awe. She carried the grief with her always after that. Every spring when the anemones opened from the ground, she remembered. Every autumn when they closed, she mourned. The cycle had no end. The pain never fully faded. But in its persistence, she found a kind of acceptance, not happiness, but the specific peace that comes from having been through the worst of something and discovered you are still present on the other side. She had learned what mortals had always known, that loving something fully means accepting the possibility of losing it completely. That the depth of joy and the depth of grief are the same measurement. That to connect deeply to anything is to make yourself vulnerable to something you cannot control. It was a hard lesson for a goddess to carry, but it made her more than she had been before. The story of Psyche arrived much later, preserved by the Roman writer Apuleius. But it captures something essential about Aphrodite that the earlier myths had only approached sideways: her capacity for jealousy, her need to be recognized as supreme in her own domain, and her willingness to test and torment anyone who challenged that supremacy. Psyche was a mortal princess, the youngest of 3 daughters, whose beauty was so far beyond ordinary beauty that people began to whisper she was Aphrodite herself, descended into mortal form. Travelers came from distant lands to look at her. They fell to their knees in her presence. They offered her the prayers and sacrifices that belonged to the goddess. The temples of Aphrodite began to empty. The altars grew cold. Aphrodite, watching from Olympus, felt the particular hot, specific taste of jealousy for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. She had been compared to beautiful women before. She had stood in that meadow above Troy and been judged against Hera and Athena and declared the winner. But this was different. Mortals were not saying Psyche was comparable to Aphrodite. They were saying she was Aphrodite, that the goddess had abandoned her divine form to walk among them as a human woman. She summoned Eros, her son, the winged god of desire, who carried the bow and arrows that could make any being, mortal or divine, fall instantly in love with the first thing they saw, and gave him a precise instruction. He was to go to this girl and strike her with his arrow and make her fall in love with the most wretched and contemptible creature available. Let her beauty be wasted on misery. Let her disappear from public admiration entirely. Eros agreed and flew to the palace where Psyche slept. He arrived invisible, as he always moved among mortals. He found her sleeping in her chamber. He drew back the arrow. He looked at her face, and the arrow grazed his own hand. The god of desire, struck by his own weapon, felt the immediate and overwhelming pull of his own power directed inward for the first time in his existence. He loved her, instantly and completely, and with no capacity to resist it. He returned to Aphrodite and lied. He told her the task was done. Then he began to arrange things differently. Psyche, meanwhile, was miserable in the specific way of someone who is too extraordinary to be approached ordinarily. Men came from everywhere to look at her, to worship her, to describe her in verse, and none of them ever came to court her. She was too much like a goddess to be addressed as a wife. Her sisters had married and left. Psyche remained, beautiful and untouched and profoundly alone. Her father, desperate, consulted the oracle at Delphi. The oracle's answer was the shape of dread. Psyche was to be dressed in mourning clothes and left at the summit of a mountain, where a husband who was not mortal would come to claim her. The procession went to the mountain. Psyche was left at the summit, alone and terrified, waiting for whatever would arrive. Instead of a monster, the west wind Zephyros came warm and gentle, the same wind that had once carried Aphrodite herself to Cyprus and lifted her carefully, carrying her down into a hidden valley where a palace of impossible beauty waited. Invisible servants met her every need. Voices offered her food and music and attended to everything she required. And at night, in complete darkness, a husband came to her. He would not let her see him, would not let her light a lamp, but his voice was kind, and his hands were gentle. And Psyche found herself falling genuinely in love with this presence she could not see. Eros had built her a paradise, a place where she could be happy, loved as a person rather than worshipped as an icon. But he could not reveal himself. If Aphrodite discovered his disobedience, everything would be destroyed. For a time, Psyche was content, but her sisters came to visit, and they saw the palace and the luxury and the love she had been given. And jealousy did what jealousy does. They convinced her that her invisible husband must be hiding something monstrous, that she should light a lamp while he slept and see the truth. Psyche was torn between love and doubt for as long as she could be. And then one night, she lit the oil lamp and held it over her sleeping husband, and she saw Eros, the most beautiful being in existence, golden-winged, astonishing, real. In her shock, the lamp tilted, and a drop of burning oil fell onto his shoulder. He woke with a sound of pain and looked at her, and what she saw in his face was not anger. It was grief. He told her that love could not exist without trust. And then he flew away. The palace dissolved around her. She was back in the mortal world, alone, carrying a child she had not told him about yet. And she understood, with the specific, helpless clarity of someone watching their own worst moment in slow motion, that she had destroyed the best thing in her life through a single moment of doubt. She wandered in search of him, and eventually she came to a temple of Aphrodite. The goddess had learned the truth by then. She knew everything about Eros's disobedience, about the marriage, about the child. Her fury was a considerable thing. She set Psyche 4 tasks, each designed to be impossible. A mountain of mixed seeds to be sorted grain by grain before morning. Golden fleece from a flock of violent sacred sheep. A flask of water from the Styx, whose source was guarded by dragons. And finally, the most dangerous of all, a descent into the underworld itself to retrieve from Persephone a box containing a portion of divine beauty. Each task was intended to kill her. Each time, something intervened. An army of ants sorted the seeds while she slept. A reed whispered instructions for gathering the fleece without being killed. An eagle sent by Zeus carried the flask to the impossible cliff and filled it. A tower gave her the exact path through the realm of the dead and back. She descended into the underworld. She retrieved the box from Persephone. She began the long climb back toward light. And then, almost at the end, almost through the impossible thing she had been set, curiosity overwhelmed her. She thought that if the box contained divine beauty, a small portion applied to herself might help her when she finally found Eros again. She thought it would be a small act, a reasonable one, a forgivable one. She opened the box. It did not contain beauty. It contained the sleep of the dead, a dark vapor that rose and surrounded her. She fell to the ground on the path between the underworld and the living world, the task incomplete at the last possible moment. Eros, who had been recovering from his burn and his grief, and who had been watching from a distance, saw her fall. He flew to her. He wiped the death sleep from her face and returned it to the box and woke her with a touch. Then he flew to Olympus and appealed directly to Zeus. He argued that Psyche had proven herself through a sequence of trials that would have broken most divine beings, let alone a mortal woman, that she had descended into death and returned, that she loved him not for his divinity, but for himself, that she deserved to be made immortal so that they could be together properly. Zeus, moved by the appeal, and perhaps also by the general satisfaction of watching something resolve itself cleanly for once, agreed. He gave Psyche ambrosia, and she was transformed, made immortal, made divine, given beauty as her own domain, rather than as something that lived only in her features. Aphrodite, faced with Zeus's decree, had no choice but to accept the marriage. She attended the wedding on Olympus, and though nothing about her expression suggested she was pleased, she acknowledged that Psyche had earned her place, had proven through suffering and persistence, and the willingness to walk into the worst dark that she was worthy of divine love. And Aphrodite, who had watched all of this from the beginning with jealousy and fury, and the gradual uncomfortable recognition that something genuine was happening, found herself arriving at a conclusion she had not anticipated. The girl who had threatened her domain had become, through the specific alchemy of her trials, something genuinely worth respecting. It was not a warm conclusion, but it was an honest one. The story of Psyche became an allegory. The soul's journey toward union with love itself, the trials that refine and reveal the quality of what a person is made of, the willingness to go into darkness and return from it changed. And Aphrodite, the obstacle who tests and torments, who stands between the soul and what it loves, became part of the story as the force that transforms, by making the passage difficult. The force that demands you prove you are serious before it gives you what you came for. Beyond the myths and the stories, beyond the great dramatic episodes, there was the lived reality of how Aphrodite was actually worshipped. The specific practices of actual people who built her temples and came to them in the dark with real prayers and real needs. Her worship spread across the ancient world from Greece to Rome, from Cyprus to the whole of Asia Minor, adapting to local customs while maintaining a core that remained recognizable everywhere. Cyprus was always her primary sanctuary, the island where she had first stepped onto land after her birth from the sea, the place she had always returned to. The temple at Paphos was the most sacred of all her shrines, and something unusual stood at its center. No statue, no carved image of a woman, a dark conical stone, a beetleless, a piece of sky that had fallen in the distant past and been recognized as sacred. This was significant. The Greeks and Romans loved their marble figures, their gods in human form. But at Paphos, Aphrodite was worshipped as a stone, as a fragment of the cosmos itself, as something that predated human categories for the divine, something that could not be fully contained in human shape. The offerings people brought her were as varied as the aspects of life she touched. Doves, sacred to her since her birth, symbols of love and the continuation of life. Roses and myrtle, mirrors, because beauty requires a surface to reflect itself on. Perfumes and cosmetics, the tools of attraction. Apples and pomegranates, shells from the sea that had made her. She carried many names, and each one pointed toward a different facet of the same force. Aphrodite Aurania, the heavenly one, associated with spiritual and transcendent love, the kind that draws the soul toward truth and beauty as principles rather than particulars. Worshipped by philosophers who saw in desire not just a physical impulse, but a cosmic force that moves all things toward unity. Aphrodite Pandemos, the common one, the earthly one, associated with physical desire and the messy, complicated passions that drive ordinary human behavior. Both names, both aspects, neither one more real or more important than the other. She was also Aphrodite Pelagia, goddess of the sea, prayed to by sailors. Aphrodite Aria, the warlike one, worshipped in Sparta, where she was understood as the patron of the passions that drive men to battle as well as to bed. Aphrodite, who grants safe passage. Aphrodite Genetrix, ancestress of the Roman people through Aeneas, her son who had walked out of burning Troy with his father on his back and founded the line that would become Rome. Each epithet was a different entry point into the same vast force. Each described a way of experiencing desire and beauty that a particular culture or circumstance needed to be able to name. When Rome encountered Aphrodite through its expansion into the Greek world, the two goddesses merged, Aphrodite absorbed into Venus, who had been a minor Roman deity of gardens and fertility before she inherited the full complexity of her Greek counterpart. The merger was not simply theological, it was political. Julius Caesar claimed descent from Venus through Aeneas and used her as the divine foundation for his own authority. He built her a great temple in Rome. Augustus continued and expanded this connection, building one of the largest temples in the empire and making Venus a symbol of Rome's divine mandate to exist. The personal and the political merged in her worship, as they always do. She became simultaneously the goddess of private longing and the emblem of imperial ambition, the patron of the bedroom and the justification of empire. But even as she was claimed by emperors and stamped onto coins and carved into monuments, ordinary people continued to worship her in the old way. They brought her flowers and doves and whispered prayers for love and marriage and children. The grand political appropriation did not erase the intimate personal one. The temples eventually fell. The rituals were forbidden. The priestesses disappeared. But the idea of Aphrodite, the recognition that desire is a force, that beauty matters, that love can create and destroy, that the same current that draws two people together can pull a civilization apart, that idea did not die. It transformed. It found new languages and new forms and new faces. She appears in modern psychology as an archetype, in art as an image that has never stopped being reproduced, in culture as a reference point everyone reaches for without having to explain it. She has been claimed by movements and ideologies, and advertising campaigns and philosophical systems. She has been simplified and distorted and stripped of her danger and her complexity. And then gradually, in each generation, restored to something closer to her original shape, because the original shape is the true one, not the greeting card, not the decorative symbol. The older, stranger, more difficult truth, that desire is a power, that beauty is dangerous, that love is simultaneously the most constructive and most destructive force in existence, and that a person who carries these things as if they were safe and predictable has not yet met them in their full form. The ancient Greeks understood this, which is why they worshipped her with reverence and also with fear. Why they told stories about her that were simultaneously celebrations and warnings. Why they recognized that her power was essential and also potentially catastrophic, and that the right response to it was not suppression, but acknowledgement, attention, the effort to understand rather than control. They did not try to eliminate desire or pretend it did not exist. They gave it a face and a name and built it temples and tried to approach it honestly. This is perhaps what survives in her. Not a being to be worshipped, not a literal goddess intervening in human affairs, but an idea that refuses to be buried, the recognition that beneath all our careful structures and rational arrangements, beneath everything we build to keep the unpredictable at bay, something exists that will not be denied, something that creates and destroys, something that makes us more fully alive than we are capable of being in any other state, and more capable of devastating ourselves and each other every time someone falls in love against every reasonable instruction from their better judgment, Aphrodite is there. Every time beauty stops a person in the middle of an ordinary moment and makes everything else feel temporarily distant and beside the point, she is there. Every time desire overrides caution and reason, and the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime of learning what not to do, she is there, not as a deity pulling strings, but as the name we give to a force we did not choose and cannot fully govern. Her myths were never meant to be historical accounts. They were meant to be true in a deeper way, to give shape and language to forces that are otherwise shapeless and overwhelming. Aphrodite's myths do this with extraordinary precision. They tell us that beauty is powerful and perilous, that desire creates and destroys, that love is worth the risk even when the cost is enormous, that some forces cannot be controlled, only met with honesty, and if possible, a certain amount of respect for what they actually are. These truths remain. They do not age. The goddess born from violence and foam, who walked from the sea onto the shore of Cyprus, who walked into Olympus and changed it simply by being present, who started wars and loved mortally and grieved deeply, and never once apologized for being what she was. She has not disappeared. She has simply become an idea. And ideas, when they are true enough, are more enduring than any temple. The sea continues its breathing, as it did before her birth, and as it will long after her name is spoken for the last time. The waves build and break and build again. The foam gathers white and luminous on the shore, and then dissolves back into the water, and then gathers again. She remains in that rhythm, in the space between the building and the breaking, in the force that draws everything toward everything else, not as she was, but as she always has been, a power that cannot be controlled, a force that cannot be held still, a reminder that beneath everything we build to keep chaos manageable, something wild and beautiful and dangerous persists. And perhaps it is in that persistence, in that refusal to be quieted or contained, that she is most herself. Let the story settle now. Let the words go soft and distant. Let the rhythm of the sea move through you like breath. Let the foam gather and dissolve at the edges of your awareness, and let yourself drift